After I'd finished with my Uber Boss farming, I decided that, as I do every league, I wanted to play a wand build. My goal with this build was to be able to comfortably run about 90 to 95% of any tier 17 maps that I rolled, and not really have to worry too much about the modifiers. I wanted to die as infrequently as possible, and I wanted the mobs and the boss to die in a somewhat acceptable amount of time. This build is somewhat similar to wand builds that I've played in the past, but there's a couple new interesting pieces of tech and some items that are making this build a little bit better than it would have been in previous leagues. And while the original goal this league is that I was going to try to make an instack wander, as I had never actually played a wand version of instack before, initially I was like, well, I kind of need to make a budget version that's going to be able to eventually turn into the instacker, and well, that budget version just ended up being the main version. If you're not aware, kind of my philosophy on making build guides for the community is that if an item that I want to use on the build is seemingly not going to be available for the vast majority of people that watch a video, I simply don't include that item in my build. If I go on the trade website and there is like 10 of an item in all of existence, that's not an item that I'm going to use. I try to make it in general that if you are able to farm around 100 divine, you can probably play any of my builds. However, even if you feel like 100 divine is a lot, I've included budget versions as well this time around. If you enjoy this content and you want to see more like it, consider giving the video a like, and also make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can stay up to date with all of my latest videos. And without further ado, let's get into it. Now, this character is a pretty standard lightning stack wander. I've played something very similar to this in the past, with all the lightning damage from replica Heries, as well as awakened added lightning damage and lightning damage on our wand. It makes it so the volatility is quite good for this build. However, there are a few new and interesting pieces of tech that are being used on this build, starting off with Svalin. Most of you are probably aware of this shield at this point, but this line that says chance to block is lucky is insanely powerful. If you don't know what lucky block is, it means that the game rolls to see whether you block once. If you don't block, it rolls it again to see if you block again. So even though this says minus 10% to maximum chance to block attack and spell damage, you can get up to 90% chance to block with this shield equipped. On top of that, it has this line that says trigger a socketed elemental spell on block with a 0.25 second cooldown. We're using this with Ball Lightning of Orbiting, mainly because I have a life gain on hit Watcher's Eye that works for spells and attacks. Ball Lightning of Orbiting gives us a ton of healing with that, even if we're not able to attack things. And then we're also using Purifying Flame. This is mainly for the Consecrated Ground effect, which gives us a bunch of defensive measures. The next interesting piece of tech that we're using is going to be this Spell Slinger Tornado setup. Now, a lot of these Kinetic Blast builds that you might see out there are using a tornado in some form. However, I saw a video by Palstron who was talking about the Kinetic Blast of Clustering, and although I'm not using it in the same exact way, I'm not doing any like fork angle mechanics or anything here, there is a pretty interesting use case specifically when you're using Barrage. It works all the time, but if we're going to use Barrage in our main link with this Tornado Spellslinger setup, you'll notice that all of the projectiles actually hit the tornado, they pierce it because we have one pierce on our gear, and then continue on. So the idea is that if the enemy is standing, say right about here, and we attack, all of those AoE overlaps from the first set of projectiles, one from each projectile will hit, the projectiles will pierce, and then also hit the enemy. So essentially we're kind of getting to double dip on our damage, which is very nice for Kinetic Blast, because it's really hard to get single target on Kinetic Blast if the enemy is not right up against a wall. And when it comes to tier 17 bosses, there's essentially only one enemy that's easy to get up against a wall, and that's going to be an Abomination, and Abomination isn't really a great map to farm anyways, so we kind of needed something, and this is what did it for us. That's pretty much all of the new tech that I'm using. If you're interested in a more in-depth analysis of the gear and everything, check later in the video where I'll go into everything in depth. So I do want to go ahead and show you guys a full tier 17 map. Now, this is a relatively difficult rolled map. It's not the most difficult map that I've ever ran, but it's also not the easiest map that I've ever ran. We've got increased AoE, which means that monsters are going to overlap a bunch, crit, additional proj, some modifiers that make me do a little bit less damage, as well as some shaper touched rares. Because I want you guys to get kind of a decent idea of what the build plays like in maps, this is a pretty similar strat to what Fubgun is running when it comes to strong boxes. I have gone with red altars just because I don't like blue altars, but most of the rest of this is very similar to Fubgun strat. You can find links to that in the notes down below. So when I say juiced tier 17s, what I mean is that On average, whenever you are running a tier 17 strategy, you're typically trying to increase the effect of the map modifiers because you want these like quantity and currency and scarabs and pack size and all of that. You want these to get increased as much as you can, which means that a lot of these dangerous modifiers like 3 additional projectiles and crit and increased area of effect, these are all going to also get increased, so it can make these maps relatively difficult. So the whole reason that I did make this build is I just wanted something that could do most modifiers. I didn't really have to worry about. I could stand in most everything and not really care too much, like shaper beams and corpse explosions and ice novas and all that kind of stuff. I just wanted, for the most part, to not have to worry about any of that stuff. I wanted to be able to clear the maps relatively quickly, and I wanted to at least be able to do the bosses even if they didn't die insanely fast. Realistically, if you want to build that can both absolutely annihilate bosses instantly and clear like this, you're gonna have to spend a lot more money. So if that's something that you want, probably looking at spending a couple hundred of divine instead of just about 100. And one thing that I've always kind of disliked about strong boxes in tier 17s is that a lot of the time you get these monsters that either are underground or difficult to find, like they spawn a mile away and it's kind of difficult to get these to open a bunch of times. But that's more so a problem with strong boxes and not really a problem with the build. So in general, when you're running around, you can kind of ignore everything. You don't have to think too much. Like, there's these explosion mods. You can pretty much always tank those. Corpse explosion on very, very dangerous maps can be somewhat dangerous. And one other thing that you do have to be careful about with this build is that anytime you have like degen effects, things that are making you just passively take damage, there's not a great way for me to get anything to heal the build. That's actually one of the main reasons that I'm using the Purifying Flame in this Fallen, because it makes it so that you can have a little tiny bit of regen and you don't just perma-degen from everything. Because for the most part, this build kind of relies off of leech and life gain on hit. Without being able to do those two things, there's a lot of damage over time that you can take, and damage over time isn't something that you can block. It's not something that you can evade, so we do need some kind of mechanic to be able to deal with that. But for the most part, as you can see, like I can stand in most of this damage. I'm not going to go out of my way to stand in most of this damage because there's not really any reason to, but for the vast majority of this, it's not really too much of a deal. I don't have a lot more to say here. I think for the most part, you guys have seen what I'm talking about when it comes to the build. If you're interested in what modifiers specifically this build can run, what alter modifiers that it can run, I go into detail in all of that in the notes. So if there is something that you're worried about, if you start playing the build and you have difficulty with why am I dying in this map, check out the notes, because there is a full section on basically every single tier 17 mod, every single alter mod, everything that you could be looking for. So we'll go ahead and jump to the boss. If any cool items or interesting thing drop, I'll put them in here. So we pretty much finished clearing the map. There weren't very many interesting drops. I think I got like a Horned Scarab of Bloodlines, which is pretty good. I'll show you that there were no deaths in the map. We still have 5 portals available here. So let's go ahead and talk about bossing. So this is the weakest part of the build for sure. I personally do a gem swap to Barrage. Without doing this, you're realistically just not going to be able to do enough damage on these very super juiced tier 17 maps. And realistically, on a build that only costs about 80 to 100 divine, you're not going to be able to have everything that you want. And this is probably the weakest portion of the build. Now, is the build super weak on single target? I don't like to think so. I still think that it does a pretty decent amount of single target damage here. But it's not going to be like the Firestorm build that I put out where you're doing like 50, 60 million DPS on single target. We're probably doing at most like 10 to 15 if things are going well. So I'll show you a little bit here with these flasks. If you look down in the bottom left, you'll see that while I am attacking for the most part, these flasks can stay up. Now, I did this exactly wrong on purpose here, but as you can see with the Ziggurat, whenever you kill one of those little mini bosses, she is going to throw her staff exactly where you were standing when they die. I was standing here in the middle when that first enemy died, and I'll show you what happens if you stand somewhere else. Now, like I said, the single target's not the most amazing, but I didn't really care about the single target in particular being great. I kind of just wanted to be able to kill the boss in an acceptable amount of time. So I'm standing here when the boss dies, or the mini boss rather, and she throws the staff right where you're standing. Now, the thing about it is that it's not actually where you're standing when she throws it, it's actually where she's standing when the boss dies, which is I think the thing that a lot of people get wrong. So I'll show you here when she goes to the next one and we clear it out. Also, if you want a trick for dealing with these little skeletons, because they can do a lot of damage, if you shield charge through them and don't get stunned infinitely, I even survived it there, which is actually pretty surprising. If you shield charge through them, most of the time you won't have an issue, but let me show you here. Let's try to see if I can get this guy to move. Am I gonna die trying to do this? Maybe? All right, we got him to move. So I'm gonna kill him here, and then I'm going to immediately jump across, and she's gonna throw the staff over where I was standing. You can see she throws it right where you were standing when the actual mini boss died. But as you can see, single target's fine. The tankiness on bosses is fine. There's not really very many issues. I even survived standing in the middle of all of those little minions that she spawned, which typically is like an instant death for most builds. And of course, in the video, I get 2 of the worst ones that I can possibly get here. Don't really care about any of that. But as you can see, tier 17's relatively easy. So this is where we're gonna go a little bit more in depth on the character itself. So starting with the skills, let's talk about Kinetic Blast. So Kinetic Blast is probably one of the best clear skills in the game, and the reason for this is that not only does it have a projectile, but it also has these circle AoEs here. Now I've put on the Heritage Kinetic Blast, you can kind of get a little bit better of an idea of how big the projectile circles actually are. So as you can see, AoE's actually pretty big on these. It's like this large. This is what makes it so that Kinetic Blast is one of the best clear skills in the game, because every projectile, every time it pierces, hits, chains, forks, returns, all of that, it causes all of these circles, right? And each one of these projectiles, as long as it hits something, a wall, or it hits another enemy, it can overlap one of its AoEs. So if you're throwing out 5 projectiles and they're all piercing or forking, every single enemy that gets hit is making all 5 or 6 of those AoEs on every single one of those projectiles every time they do any kind of projectile mechanic. It gives you an insane amount of hits on clear, and it's the reason why it is one of the most powerful clear builds in the game. Now the Achilles heel to Kinetic Blast has always been that single target is rough. I have put a setup in the notes where you don't have to do a gem swap, because you probably saw the gem swap and you're like, I really don't want to do a gem swap. But realistically, with this skill, you are not going to do good single target damage unless the enemy is up against the wall or you use barrage. That is just how the skill works, unless you want to spend multiple mirrors making sure that you do an infinite amount of damage. It's just not going to work that way. As for some of our supporting skills, we do have 2 movement skills. I'm using shield charge because we are using a shield. This is the best just generic movement skill if you're using a shield. I'm using flame dash to gap close. You could use pretty much anything that you want to, but flame dash is probably the best here since we're not scaling any kind of cast speed. For our utility spells, we have 2 that we typically press. That's going to be Sigil of Power. The idea behind Sigil of Power is that it does 2 major things. It causes you to gain added lightning damage, which is the main thing our build is doing, and it also makes it so that enemies that are standing in the circle when you are at maximum stages deal significantly less damage. I have this gem at level 6 specifically because it requires 121 mana, which is the amount of mana that I spend per second. So it only takes a maximum of 4 seconds to be able to have this at full power. The other skill that I'm using is going to be Immortal Call. We do get endurance charges on this build whenever we block, which is a lot of the time. The 25% chance to gain an endurance charge when we block, so we have endurance charges pretty often. And if there's a big ability coming in, you can just hit Immortal Call and be pretty tanky for anywhere from like 2 to 4 seconds. Now talking about the auras that we're running, on our mana, we are running Grace as well as Tempest Shield. We want Evasion, we want Spell Block. These 2 things are pretty good. Notably with Tempest Shield on Reflect maps, you can't actually kill yourself to this. I honestly hate the fact that we are scaling so much generic lightning damage in general, because it actually makes this kind of kill you on Reflect map sometimes. But beyond that, we're also using Aspect of the Crab. These are the 3 auras that we have on our mana, as well as Spell Slinger, which I talked a little bit about earlier in the video. On our life, we do have a level 1 Vitality. This is to enable our Watcher's Eye. And then we're using Precision, just a high enough level to be able to cap our accuracy in Path of Building. And lastly, for our proc skills, I kind of already talked about Ball Lightning of Orbiting and Purifying Flame. We use this for life gain, and we use Purifying Flame for Consecrated Ground. And then we do have an Assassin's Mark on hit. Talking a little bit about the gear, the vast majority of this gear is just going to be a Fractured mod, and then I use an Essence to be able to roll the 3rd suffix or 3rd prefix. And I'm using Eldritch Currency most of the time to just get 1 prefix or 1 suffix and then crafting them on. That's what the vast majority of this is. It's nothing really super expensive. None of these bases are insane. It's not like they're the top tier bases with the top tier mods. This is like the third or fourth best base with a tier 2 suppression roll. This is the third or fourth best base with a chaos resistance roll. This is probably the base that could get the most expensive, but it's just expensive for no real reason. You could get a little bit lower of a life roll on a little bit lower of a base and it'll be perfectly fine. But that's most of this. This isn't any kind of insane crazy gear. Like, I'm using a tier 3 fractured ring at the moment. Beyond that, it's mostly just uniques. These could probably be a couple divine at most. Getting a 6 link is not hard right now. The off colors are probably going to be more expensive than actually getting it 6 length. We're using Svalin. A very good Svalin is a couple divine, but I'm using a 12% one. A 12% one currently is 90 to 100 chaos. I'm using Dying Sun. Dying Sun with these mods is currently 8 divine. You don't need it to be this good. The only reason this is so expensive is because it's off of Shaper, but it's a very, very good flask. And then out of the normal gear, the last piece is going to be the wand. I've put extensive notes on how to craft a wand like this. This particular wand, as is, does have a global crit strike multi on it, which makes it significantly more expensive. However, you can make a wand like 85 to 90% as good as this for significantly less money. It's all detailed in the notes on how to make this wand. Next, I want to talk about jewels. We do use a bunch of these Abyss jewels. These are actually way easier to craft than you realize, and I'll show you what I mean. So here in my dumpster tab of all of the items that I've tried using on this build, we have this jewel right here. So this is Fractured Tier 2 added lightning damage with wands. What you do is you come over to the Hoarder crafting station, you pop this in, you type crit, and you just roll it with this Reforge crit. A lot of the time it's going to give you that global crit strike multi-mod there. You just do this until you get that plus something else good. It's honestly not that hard to get something pretty decent. A lot of the time it takes like 10 or 15 rolls to get a halfway decent mod. There you go, this would be keepable, right? Lightning damage to attacks, global crit strike multi, fire damage to wand attacks. You can keep going here. There you go, strength and dexterity and life with global crit multi. A lot of the time when you're crafting with this, you can use things like exalted orbs to add a final modifier on there, but it's honestly not that hard to get something pretty decent. Like global crit multi, life, and chance to block attack damage is pretty good. As you can see, like for here, you would use an exalted orb. So let's go ahead and grab an exalt. I think I have some. And then you'd use an exalt on this, and you'd get whatever, 5 to 10 cold damage to attacks, probably a keepable roll. These are not that hard to roll, just get the base and roll them with this kind of currency. The same goes for the one particular jewel that I have here, which I think is this one. You get either chance to avoid being shocked or chance to gain phasing fractured, and then just use lightning rerolls until you get the other mod. This one's probably harder, but still not that difficult. Continuing with jewels, I am using a Light of Meaning jewel with lightning damage. If this gets absurdly expensive, it's like 5 to 10% better than just having a timeless jewel here and getting, like, you know, intimidate on hit and a bunch of strength and other things. I honestly think that's probably just better most of the time. I'm using this because I have a ton of nodes here and it's like 5 or 10% more damage, I think. So that's also detailed in the notes. I'm using a Watcher's Eye. The only modifier on here that really matters is that gain life per enemy hit with affected by vitality. If we go for just that modifier, it's currently 2 divine. If we go for both of these modifiers, it's much more expensive, but you can get any precision mod that you like. You could also get grace mods, but those are going to be very, very expensive. Lastly, we are using Storm Shroud as our source of elemental ailment avoidance. This plus the modifiers on our boots, as well as these life nodes and this jewel that I showed you a moment ago, are enough to be completely elemental ailment avoidant. Lastly, let's talk about cluster jewels. We're using 2 large clusters like this one. Keep in mind that this exact setup of cluster might end up being expensive. The modifier that I would say that you would want to focus on is that if you're wanting more damage, you just make sure that you get Feed the Fury plus any other good notable here. If you're focusing more on defenses, get Prodigious Defense and any other good modifier here. We don't take the modifier in the back, you can test it in Path of Building. As for the small cluster jewel, we are using a mana reservation efficiency one with Sublime Form. This is a bunch of LE resist, which helps out the build and gives us 50% increased mana reservation efficiency of grace. We have gotten elemental resistances on here. Any other modifiers that you want or need, this is a good place to get them. It's only 1 node, but still. As always, I have extensive notes about this. If you have any questions needing to be asked, I highly suggest that you go and take a look at these notes first. If something is not in the 26,000 characters and 4,700 words that I've written in here, come and join my Discord. There's going to be a specific channel on my Discord about this build. Keep discussions about the build to that channel, please. You can ping me in there if you absolutely need to, but for the most part, you'll probably be able to find the answer to your question there. Now, in these notes, you'll find a link to the all-in-one path of building here. That is going to be this path of building here. This POB has 5 separate setups that you'll find in the loadouts up here. There is my character. This is how the character that you see in the video is set up if you want to have exactly the same experience. There is a base character setup, which is using essentially gear that I think everyone could get and I wouldn't have to worry too much about being able to get. This kind of gear should be obtainable by the vast majority of people, even if there's any like weird small changes on any of the gear on my character that maybe are too difficult to get. Beyond that, we have a setup with no gem swap. The only real change here is that you're going to be using a different helmet because you need a little bit of mana reservation efficiency, and you're going to be using a separate clear setup for Kinetic Blast. This is for people who either want to be able to do better single target while they're randomly clearing through maps, or don't want to have to do that gem swap. You do lose a decent amount here. You lose the Svalin spells and you lose a little bit of physical damage taken, so do keep that in mind, but this setup is perfectly fine if you don't want to do that gem swap. And lastly, I have 2 separate setups here as well. Most of these 3 setups, the my character base and no gem swap, are going to be relatively similar. When you swap between these, you're not really going to be seeing the tree change almost at all. This budget setup is going to be pretty significantly different. The tree is slightly different, the skills are slightly different, and the items are very different. This is a very simple setup. It's good for just farming some easy tier 16 maps. I suggest you move from this to the higher end setup as soon as you can, but this should at least get you going and get you farming some currency. When it comes to the trees for this setup, I have included the leveling trees that you can see here. There's separate trees as well as level by level trees for every version of the build. And when it comes to leveling, I do have a full leveling setup for people who want to do some like juiced leveling. It tells you the skills that you can use. These are the items that I personally use to level this character. I went from level 1 on the beach, spent 20 minutes buying all of the gear, and then got to 95 in one sitting. This is just a bunch of leveling uniques. I made a wand from level 1. I made a twig spirit shield from level 1, and I used some leveling searching eye jewels that actually have levels 0 requirements so that I could level with Kinetic Bolt, and then Power Siphon, and then Kinetic Blast. And that's going to be it for the video. If you have any further questions, make sure to check out those notes and then go check out the Discord. I'll be updating the notes over time as things change, or as people inevitably have small problems with the build. I'll make sure to put those updates in the notes down below in the description. And remember, boys, if you enjoy this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in raid class. And I'll see you guys in the next video.